I'm Hannah Cole, 33, and this morning at Maple Ridge Community Credit Union, a man in a gray suit slides a stack of forms toward me while autumn light flickers across the lobby floor, the kind of light that usually steadies my breathing. The forms carry a signature that looks like mine from years ago. Loops I no longer make a slant. I trained myself out of in college. My stepfather Raymond watches my face the way a card player watches a turn. He says it's a simple refinance that we talked about this after dinner, that family moves fast when opportunity knocks, and his smile touches everything but his eyes. When I don't pick up the pen, his hand grips my elbow sharp and familiar, and the room quiets as if the air itself is waiting for an answer. I realize this isn't a favor or a misunderstanding. This is a door swinging open on something that has been running beneath my life for a long time. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to stand your ground when someone expected you to fold. I grew up in a small ranch house where our father, a high school science teacher, kept a coffee can of screws in the garage and taught us to put things back where we found them. When he got sick, my brother Mason learned to fix whatever broke, and I learned to plan, list, and carry what he couldn't. After Dad died, our mother Evelyn fell in love with a man who knew how to fill a room with stories and promises, and for a while it felt like air returning to a house that had been holding its breath. Raymond talked about smart money and ventures that could lift everyone, and I tried to believe him because it made Mom smile in a way I hadn't seen in months. I worked my way through school, took the early shifts and the late ones, and landed in logistics, where details mean everything. What trucks roll, what docks open, what signatures count. The values I carried: pay what you owe, say what you mean, write it down. Didn't change when I moved from our quiet street to a world of conference rooms and travel itineraries. But I could feel the gap widening between the steady way I built my life and the way Raymond chased the next big thing. At our Sunday dinners, the talk drifted toward investment plans and a little help to make them happen. The words were smooth, the asks were small, and every time I hesitated, Mom would touch my wrist and say, "Family helps family," with a softness that made no room for questions. I noticed envelopes on the hall table slit open with the dull butter knife, my name tucked into piles that didn't look like mine. When I asked, I was told it was a mix-up at the mailboxes, or a habit left over from when I lived at home. When my promotion came through, Raymond toasted with sparkling cider and asked what bonuses looked like in my industry these days, casual as a neighbor asking about the weather. I told myself it was curiosity, that he liked to keep tabs, because he wanted good things for all of us the way he said out loud in front of my mother. The truth even then rode like static around the edges of those evenings, small shocks I ignored because we were trying to be a family that worked. This morning he said we'd be in and out before I finished my coffee, that Arthur the branch manager knew him well, that all I needed was to add my signature so a rate lock wouldn't slip away. The lobby smells faintly of lemon polish and drip coffee, the kind of ordinary that should make a person feel safe. Instead, the pen line trembles slightly on the paper in front of me, and the handwriting above it looks like a photograph of my hand from a different year. Arthur clears his throat and mentions inconsistencies, a verification flag, a date that lands on a week when my calendar shows I was in Dallas, badge around my neck, presenting on dock throughput. Raymond's jaw sets in a line I recognize from every time life told him no, and his voice lowers just enough to remind me of how tightly he likes a door to shut. I keep my hands in my lap and meet the manager's eyes, and the steady hum of the lobby pulls thin as I ask quietly how many documents carry a version of my name. The chair legs scrape softly as I stand. My mother shifts in her seat without looking up, and the pen waits where they placed it, blue ink shining under the lights. Somewhere outside, wind lifts crisp leaves across the glass, the color of warnings and endings, and I can feel the shape of a choice rising like a shoreline ahead. I walked out of the credit union that morning with the echo of Raymond's voice still in my ears, the words about family and loyalty bending until they sounded like threats. Mason's truck pulled to the curb 20 minutes later, his boots hitting the pavement hard as he came toward me. He took one look at the torn seam on my blouse and the scratch across my collarbone, and his jaw set in the way it always did when someone crossed a line. "We're not letting this slide," he said quietly, guiding me toward his truck. The scent of sawdust still clung to his flannel shirt, a reminder of the life he'd built, with steady hands far from the schemes that seemed to follow our stepfather. Mason told me to document everything before they had a chance to twist the story. His calm voice steadied me as he reminded me of the lessons our dad used to repeat, that facts carried weight, even when voices shouted louder. We spent that afternoon gathering every scrap of mail, every notice, every envelope that had come to my apartment, opened or misplaced. By nightfall, I had a file folder thick enough to prove something was deeply wrong. Mason made a call to a woman he trusted, a lawyer named Clara Jensen, who had worked on financial fraud cases for 2 decades. She agreed to see us first thing in the morning. Clara's office downtown felt like a fortress of polished wood and glass, the kind of place where words like order and justice carried weight. She spread my credit reports across her desk with careful precision, her red nails tapping each page as she explained what they meant. $62,000 in debt tied to your name, she said, her voice even, and that's only what we've been able to confirm so far. I leaned closer, my breath catching as she pointed out the 4 credit cards I had never seen all maxed out, and now in collections. There was an auto loan denial citing a poor payment history that wasn't mine, and a personal loan with a predatory interest rate signed with a version of my name. The worst of it wasn't just the money. Clara showed me how all statements had been sent to my mother's address. Systematic mail diversion, she explained, a common tactic in family-based identity theft. I stared at the unfamiliar P.O. box listed on the screen and realized it had been in play for years without me knowing. Raymond hadn't stumbled into this. He had built it step by step with someone at the bank helping him override signature flags. Clara slid another folder forward, her tone measured but heavy. This wasn't sloppy. This was coordinated, and it wasn't his first time. I looked up sharply. "What do you mean, not his first time?" Clara hesitated before pulling out a summary from an older case file. 10 years earlier, Raymond had been accused of a similar scheme involving his first wife's daughter. That case had been settled quietly buried before it reached a courtroom. The realization settled over me like ice. The pieces of my own life began shifting into place, the casual questions about my savings, the opened mail, the sudden interest in my new apartment. It had never been curiosity or care. It was groundwork. Mason returned with a manila folder he had pulled from Dad's old boxes. Inside was paperwork for a trust fund, $20,000 from Dad's life insurance meant to mature when I turned 25. "Where is it?" he asked quietly, though the answer was already written across the dates. The account had been drained 3 months after my birthday gone before I even knew it existed. My chest tightened with a different kind of pain, not just theft, but the loss of something Dad had meant as a safety net. "They weren't just stealing money," I whispered, tracing the empty numbers on the page. "They were stealing the future he wanted for me." Clara gave us time to sit with it, her patience shaped by years of watching clients process similar betrayals. Then she leaned forward, her voice steady. "This leaves a trail," she said, "and trails can be followed. We'll build this case with both criminal charges and civil restitution. But you need to be prepared. They will fight back hard." Mason reached across the table and set his hand on mine. "Then we fight harder," he said, his voice firm, his blue eyes holding steady like they always did. That evening, as I sat at Mason's bungalow with folders spread across the kitchen table, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from my mother. Her voice trembled with tears as she pleaded for me to call. "It was just supposed to be temporary," she said. "We never meant for it to go this far." The words wrapped themselves in guilt, the same guilt she had used for years, reminding me that family doesn't abandon family. Mason pressed play again, his jaw tightening. "She's not sorry, Hannah," he said. "She's scared." A text followed from an old family friend. "Victor says you're overreacting. No one will believe you over your mother." The threat landed exactly where it was aimed, but this time it didn't bend me. It cleared something inside me instead. Clara called later that night after reviewing the files again. "We'll pursue this on 2 tracks, she explained, her tone sharp with professional focus. "Criminal charges for the fraud and theft, civil action for financial damages." Mason slid a business card across the table with the name of a fraud investigator at the credit bureau. The bank is preparing an affidavit declaring you the victim. That will help clear your credit. For the first time since this began, I felt the weight shifting, not gone, but no longer pressing me flat. A team was forming, and I wasn't standing alone against them anymore. Mason brewed a pot of coffee while Clara outlined the next steps. Start a timeline. Every document, every notice, every interaction. The more detail, the stronger the case. She warned us that Victor and Evelyn had nothing left to lose, and that made them dangerous. They'll try to intimidate you, she said, because silence works in their favor. I sat with my pen poised over the first affidavit, the paper cool under my hand. Then we don't give them silence, I said, my voice steady for the first time in days. Later, Mason brought out a laptop he had found tucked in the back of my coat closet. It was one of Raymond's old machines left behind without thought. Check it, Mason said, sliding it across the table. See what's inside. I typed in the password, my birthday of course, and the screen flickered to life. At first it was only clutter-old photos, travel documents, a mess of folders. Then I saw one labeled Property Management. Inside was a spreadsheet that made my stomach drop. It was meticulous, color-coded by dates and accounts, all tied to my name. Each tab tracked something different. Payment due dates, credit limits, bureau reporting schedules. One sheet listed every account, including retirement and savings, with notes on my direct deposit schedule. A handwritten note in the corner read, "Bonus expected March 15th, for the $200. The detail was chilling. They knew not just my accounts, but the rhythm of my paychecks. The final blow came when I clicked on an email thread. Raymond had written to a loan officer named Brandon Weiss, instructing him on how to push paperwork through with my forged signature. And there, nestled in the exchange, was a note about my mother Lillian found the perfect signature in her keepsake box, her high school graduation card. Use that sample. I stared at the screen, the room tilting slightly as the truth clicked into place. My mother hadn't just stood by. She had handed them the key. I backed up the file, emailed it to Clara, and sat back in my chair with a calm I hadn't felt since the day at the bank. I can prove it now, I told her over the phone. Every last piece. The following Sunday, Mason parked in front of my mother's white colonial, the familiar shutters casting shadows across the lawn. Neighbors were out tending gardens, walking dogs, trimming hedges. Witnesses. I clutched a leather portfolio filled with printed copies of the spreadsheet, the emails and the first draft of a restraining order. Mason squeezed my hand once before we walked the brick path to the front door. The bell echoed, and when Raymond opened the door, the smile slipped from his face the moment he saw what I was holding. "We need to talk," I said evenly, stepping forward. Behind him, Mom froze in the hallway, a dish towel still in her hands. For the first time in years, the house that had always held me small didn't feel like it had power anymore. It was just walls, and we were about to bring them down. The night after we confronted my mother and Raymond with the evidence, the weight of their silence followed me back to Mason's bungalow. My mother hadn't shouted or denied as much as I thought she might. She just sat on the sofa, wringing the dish towel in her hands, while Raymond's face darkened with anger he couldn't fully contain. Walking out of that house should have felt like victory, but instead, it left a hollow ache that seemed to echo louder when the lights went off. At Mason's kitchen table, the folders of proof were stacked neatly where we'd left them. I couldn't stop replaying my mother's voice in my mind, the way it wavered just enough to sound fragile, asking why I would humiliate her like that. By morning, her words were no longer just memory. They were in my voicemail, long messages laced with sobs and pleas that sounded carefully rehearsed. "We only wanted to help," she said, in one the tremor in her tone carrying more accusation than apology. In another, she begged me to remember that family doesn't abandon family. The calls didn't stop. By the third day, neighbors from her church were phoning too. Messages came with scripture-gentle rebukes about forgiveness and reminders of how much my mother loved me. It was as though she had taken the story to every pew and gathering, painting me as the daughter who had turned against her own blood. The weight of their voices pressed on me until it felt like the walls of Mason's bungalow were closing in. Mason noticed it before I said anything. He saw the way my shoulders hunched when the phone rang, the way I paused before listening to another message. "They're trying to box you in," he said, setting his coffee mug down with more force than he meant to. "They know shame is their best weapon." I nodded but kept silent, staring at the chipped edge of the kitchen counter, wishing for the kind of certainty that came so naturally to him. That week I returned to my apartment to gather some clothes. The moment I opened the door, I knew something was wrong. A cold draft swept through the rooms, and the smell of spray paint clung to the air. The living room looked as though a storm had passed through, drawers, overturned pictures shattered, and glass glittering like sand across the carpet. On the wall, in red letters 3 feet high, were the words, "Family First." The sight rooted me in place, my chest tightening with a fear I hadn't felt since the day at the bank. Officer Merritt from the local precinct arrived within the hour, her camera flashing as she documented the damage. "Looks like they were after paperwork," she said, crouching by my pried-open file cabinet. Shredded fragments of affidavits and statements lay scattered across the floor. But they wanted to leave a message, too. She gestured toward the dripping letters on the wall. Mason's voice cut through the silence, low and steady. "This is a violation of the restraining order. He's not supposed to be anywhere near here." At the station, I repeated the details for the report, while Officer Merritt typed them out, her fingers brisk on the keyboard. "They're trying to scare you into backing off," she said, glancing up once. "Did it work?" The question lingered heavier than it should have. I thought about the ruined apartment, the warnings whispered through paint and glass. Then I heard myself answer with a steadiness I didn't expect. "No, it just proves I'm doing the right thing." Back at Mason's, Clara spread the photographs across the dining room table, her expression tightening as she examined each one. "This is intimidation, plain and simple," she said. "They know you have the evidence, and they want you to doubt yourself." Her assistant had overheard Raymond asking questions about her past cases at the courthouse, probing for weaknesses he could exploit. She folded her hands over the photographs. "He's trying to rattle me, too." I offered to find another lawyer if it meant protecting her, but Clara shook her head sharply. "Absolutely not. This is exactly why I do what I do. They want us shaken second-guessing. We won't give them that." Mason busied himself with the locks, installing additional cameras around the bungalow until the whir of his drill became the evening soundtrack. The next morning, Clara met us with a man I hadn't seen before, a prosecutor named Jackson Reeves. His silver hair and calm presence carried a weight that filled the room. "You've done exceptional work gathering this documentation," he said, as he flipped through binders Mason had compiled. "It's rare to have such a thorough case in identity theft." His tone was steady, almost reassuring, but his eyes carried the sharpness of someone who had seen too many families unravel this way. I listened as they talked about filing charges, my mind drifting back to the words painted on my wall. I wondered how far my mother would let this go, how deeply she believed the story they were spinning for the community. Messages still trickled onto my phone friends of hers from church-old neighbors who thought they knew me, each voice echoing the same refrain. They told me I was cruel, that I was abandoning my mother when she needed me most. Late that night, as I lay awake in Mason's guest room, I thought of the empty apartment waiting under police tape. I thought of the photographs I used to keep on the wall, my father smiling with his arm around me, Mason standing tall in his uniform. All of it shattered now, reduced to fragments on the floor. The silence of the house pressed in, broken only by the faint hum of the security cameras Mason had wired along the eaves. I sat up and reached for the folder on the nightstand. Inside were the spreadsheets, the emails, the documents Clara had helped me copy and preserve. I ran my hand over the pages, each one a reminder of the truth they couldn't erase, no matter how many walls they painted or cabinets they broke. The fear was still there, but it was layered now with something heavier, something steadier. By the time dawn light crept across the blinds, I was no longer thinking about whether I should keep going. I was thinking about how to hold steady against whatever came next. The morning after the break-in, Mason drilled a final bracket into the eaves of his bungalow, the whir of the driver steady as he mounted a security camera above the back door. I held the ladder in place, watching him work with the same quiet focus he used on cabinetry jobs. "One more here," he said, adjusting the angle until the lens faced the alley. "Then tomorrow we'll set up the same system at your apartment." His voice carried calm resolve, but I caught the lines of worry carved deeper across his face. Inside, Clara spread more documents across the dining room table, her pen tapping against a notepad as she outlined our next moves. The bank's fraud department had agreed to release 5 years of transaction histories, and the credit bureaus had placed flags on my accounts to prevent new lines of credit from being opened. "We're building something solid," she said, sliding the reports into labeled binders. "But you need to know Raymond's not backing down." He retained Jonathan Mercer. The name landed with a weight I couldn't ignore. Mercer's reputation as a defense attorney was well known in the county, his last big case ending with a fraud defendant walking free on a technicality. Clara met my eyes. "This tells us 2 things. First, they still have resources. Second, they'll try to stall and wear you down." Mason rested his forearms on the table, speaking with quiet certainty. "Then we move faster." That night Clara called after reviewing the older accounts again. "There's a limitation on the earliest fraudulent loans," she explained, her voice tight. "We can't include 3 of them in the criminal complaint. Too much time has passed." For a moment, panic stirred inside me, but I steadied my breath as she continued. "The most recent violations are strong. Those are enough to carry this forward." I sat at my desk, the folders spread neatly in front of me, and reminded myself that what mattered wasn't what slipped away, but what could still be proven. By the weekend, I had taken on the task of building timelines myself. Color-coded spreadsheets filled my laptop screen, each account traced from application to balance, each forged signature paired with travel records that placed me hundreds of miles away. The work felt relentless, but there was something steadying in the details, each line a thread weaving into a net that left less and less room for doubt. Mason walked past with 2 mugs of coffee, glancing at the monitor. "You're turning into an investigator," he said softly, pride flickering behind his tired eyes. Clara scheduled another meeting with Jackson Reeves, this time in her office. The conference table was covered in binders and evidence boxes, the smell of lemon polish and fresh coffee filling the air. Jackson flipped through the files, nodding as he examined the statements. "This is one of the most comprehensive identity theft cases I've seen prepared," he said. "We're ready to file, but timing is everything. They'll try to delay, maybe even destroy what they can." He paused, his gaze steady on me. "Are you ready to see this through?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. It was Officer Merritt. "Ms. Cole, I'm calling about your lake cabin. There's been another break-in. You should come." Her voice was clipped professional, but I could hear the undertone. By the time Mason and I arrived, deputies were already there, the broken glass crunching beneath our shoes as we stepped inside. Windows shattered, furniture overturned, and across the living room wall, spray paint again slashing words that made my throat tighten. Outside, one of the deputies held up a photo album, its pages torn and scattered along the dock, the wind lifting pieces of my childhood into the water. My hands shook as I gathered the damp edges, the images smudged and broken. Clara's voice on the phone carried the weight of urgency. "We can use this. Mason installed wildlife cameras last week, didn't he?" Mason was already pulling a memory card from the device near the dock. Hours later, clear photographs showed Raymond smashing a window at dawn, his red Buick parked in full view of the lens. Clara filed the violation immediately. That same afternoon, Raymond's attorney petitioned the court claiming I was unstable, that I had invented the entire fraud case after a family disagreement. The motion was calculated, arriving the same day Jackson's office planned to finalize our filing. As I scrolled through text messages from my mother's friends, each echoing her story about a daughter lost to anger, I felt the pull of a familiar shame. But this time the evidence pushed back harder. By evening, the photographs from the cabin were in Clara's hands, complete with timestamps and GPS data. "This proves everything we need," she said, her voice sharpened by determination. "They've overreached, and now we have them." Mason downloaded the files to 3 separate drives, tucking one into his pocket like it was made of gold. That night, I sat at his dining room table with the binders open around me, my pen steady in my hand, as I reviewed my testimony for the first time. The fear that had once felt like a weight on my chest shifted into something clearer, something stronger. They had tried to erase proof, to twist the story, to paint me as the problem. But in trying so hard, they had given me the strongest evidence yet. When the call came from Clara near midnight, her words carried a finality I hadn't expected so soon. The prosecutor just issued an arrest warrant for Raymond on the restraining order violation and property damage. He'll be taken into custody tonight. I set the phone down on the table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence as Mason looked across at me. "This is happening," he said. I nodded, feeling the steady rise of readiness settle deeper inside me. Through the kitchen window, the night sky stretched wide stars glinting above the quiet street. For weeks, my life had been caught in fear and waiting. But now, with binders stacked and evidence secured, I knew exactly where we were headed. The county courthouse smelled faintly of lemon polish and old wood, the kind of scent that clung to places where decisions carried weight. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, spilling across the marble floor in thin gold bands. I sat on a wooden bench near the front, my fingers brushing the smooth surface as people filed in their low conversations echoing through the vaulted ceiling. Mason sat beside me, his broad shoulders forming a wall of quiet steadiness. Across the aisle, Clara flipped through binders one last time, tabs and sticky notes neatly aligned. Jackson Reeves leaned against the rail, speaking in low tones with a court officer. When the side door opened, my breath caught. Raymond entered first, his gray suit pressed sharp, his tie knotted with practiced precision. Evelyn followed close behind her cardigan, draped carefully across her shoulders, her eyes downcast in a way that looked deliberate. They took their seats beside their attorney, Lawrence Mercer, who adjusted his cufflinks with the calm of someone used to commanding attention. The murmur of the gallery rose and fell like a tied neighbors and church friends whispering behind their hands. Judge Meredith Lane entered moments later, her black robe moving easily as she took the bench. The room quieted instantly when her gavel struck once against the block. Her eyes swept across the gallery, sharp and assessing, before settling on the attorneys. "We are here to review charges of identity theft fraud and violations of a restraining order," she began, her voice carrying evenly across the chamber. Mercer rose first, his silver hair catching the light. He painted the picture with practiced ease, a daughter impulsive with money, a family simply trying to help a misunderstanding that had spiraled into false accusations after a disagreement about business investments. He gestured toward Evelyn, whose eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Mrs. Burke and Mr. Burke only sought to protect their daughter from her own recklessness," he said, his voice calm and smooth. "What you see here is not fraud, but family tension twisted into something it never was." The words stung, not because they were true, but because I could see how easily others might believe them. When Evelyn took the stand, she spoke with a tremor in her voice that carried just enough vulnerability to sound convincing. "We only wanted to help her," she said, her hands twisting the tissue in her lap. "Hannah has always been quick to spend quick to trust the wrong people. We thought if we managed things quietly, she would be safe." She dabbed at her eyes, looking every bit the worried mother. Clara rose for cross-examination, her voice steady but precise. "Mrs. Burke, you testified that your daughter authorized these loans. Can you tell us when and where that authorization occurred?" Evelyn shifted her gaze, flicking toward Raymond before she answered. "Well, we talked about it several times, at family dinners mostly." Clara's tone sharpened slightly. "Specific dates, please." Evelyn faltered, finally landing on a dinner in February after my birthday. Clara lifted a page from her binder. According to her employer, Ms. Cole was in Dallas that week, presenting at a logistics conference. I have her plane ticket, hotel receipt, and registration badge. Would you like the court to see them? Evelyn's face flushed as she stammered. Then it must have been March. Clara's eyes didn't waver. Interesting, because the first fraudulent account was opened in January. Bit by bit, Clara dismantled the picture they had painted. Each contradiction pressed Evelyn deeper into silence until her voice grew faint and her shoulders slumped. Then Jackson Reeves called his witnesses. Arthur McKay stepped forward first, his silver-rimmed glasses glinting under the lights. He spoke clearly about the signatures flagged at the bank, pointing out the differences in slant and style. Once we found the first forgery, he explained, we identified at least 7 others, all connected to accounts in Ms. Cole's name. His tone was steady, unflinching. Next came Brandon Weiss, the loan officer whose cooperation Clara had secured. His hands shook slightly as he held the microphone, his voice uneven at first. Mr. Burke told me it was a family arrangement, he said. He said his stepdaughter was busy with work, but she had authorized everything. He gave me samples of her old signatures to use when the system flagged them. He glanced nervously at Raymond before lowering his eyes. Finally, Clara presented the spreadsheet from Raymond's laptop. Enlarged on the courtroom screen, the tabs and color-coded entries filled the room with silence. Payment schedules, credit limits, notes about my direct deposit and travel calendar. Every detail laid out with chilling precision. Clara pointed to one line. "Mr. Burke, can you explain why you tracked Ms. Cole's work travel against mail delivery dates?" Raymond leaned forward, his jaw tight. "I was helping manage her finances," Clara pressed. By intercepting her mail, he shifted in his seat, his voice hardening. "I don't recall." Clara's tone remained calm. "And can you explain these notations about her bonus and direct deposit figures that match exactly to what her employer provided in payroll records?" Raymond's silence stretched until the judge prompted him. Finally, he muttered, "Yes, I made the spreadsheet." Clara's expression didn't change. She gathered her notes, leaving his admission to hang in the air. When Judge Lane called a recess, the gallery erupted into hushed whispers. Some of my mother's friends shifted uneasily, no longer looking at me with suspicion, but at Evelyn with doubt. Mrs. Peterson, who had known me since childhood, crossed the aisle and squeezed my shoulder before returning to her seat. Mason leaned close, his voice barely above a whisper. "They can't talk their way out of this anymore." I sat back against the bench, my hands folded tightly in my lap. For weeks I had felt like I was pushing against shadows, their lies twisting around me until I questioned my own footing. Now, piece by piece, those shadows were giving way to something stronger. The evidence had spoken louder than their stories, and for the first time since it began, I felt the ground steady beneath me. When the judge returned, her expression was measured but decisive. Based on the evidence presented, she said this court finds sufficient cause to expand the restraining order to include Mrs. Burke. Mr. Reeves, does the state wish to proceed with charges? Jackson rose without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor. We are filing formal charges of identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy." The gavel struck once more, echoing through the chamber as court officers stepped forward. Raymond's jaw tightened as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Evelyn's hands twisted in her lap, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. I sat quietly, my breath steady, as the gallery watched the people who had once held such control over me, reduced to defendants facing the weight of the law. The day wasn't over, but the turning point had arrived. I could feel it in the silence of the room, in the way the whispers shifted, in the way Mason's hand rested steady on my shoulder. For the first time, the lies no longer defined the story. The truth did. When the gavel struck and Raymond was led out in handcuffs, the air in the courtroom shifted. The gallery whispered, some leaning away from Evelyn as if proximity might taint them. I sat still, breathing slowly, watching the man who once controlled every room walk out as a prisoner. Evelyn remained at the defense table, her face pale, her hands twisting the tissue until it tore into threads. The judge ordered a short recess before reconvening for the bail hearing. Clara leaned close, her voice low but firm. "This is the pivot. Don't lose your composure now. They'll try to claw back anything they can." Mason nodded beside me, his expression unreadable, though I could feel the tension in his shoulders. When the session resumed, Mercer argued for release under supervision. He spoke of Raymond's ties to the community, his business investments, and his role as a caretaker for Evelyn. Judge Lane listened without interruption, then turned her gaze toward Jackson. "The state's position?" she asked. Jackson rose, his tone clipped. "Given the restraining order violations, the vandalism, and the intimidation tactics, we believe Mr. Burke is a flight risk and a danger to the complainant." His words left no room for doubt. The judge ruled swiftly, denying bail. The deputies escorted Raymond out as Evelyn called his name, her voice cracking. He didn't turn. I caught the eyes of Mrs. Peterson in the gallery, the Sunday school teacher who had once braided my hair for Christmas plays. She nodded at me, a quiet show of solidarity that carried more weight than I expected. The following week blurred with preparations. Clara brought in specialists from the credit bureaus and investigators from the bank, each one contributing to the growing net of proof. My evenings were spent at Mason's dining room table, cross-referencing dates and signatures until the pages blurred. At night, I lay awake in the guest room, hearing the hum of the security cameras outside, the quiet reassurance that we weren't unprotected. The intimidation didn't stop. Flyers appeared at Mason's job site, accusing me of ruining my mother's life. Anonymous notes slid under the door at his shop, urging him to convince me to withdraw. Clara warned us to expect more to hold steady. Mason burned the flyers in a metal trash can behind his workshop without a word. The smoke curled into the evening sky as he stood watch, jaw set tight. Court resumed 2 weeks later for the formal arraignment. Evelyn arrived alone this time, her eyes red-rimmed, her posture fragile. Mercer argued for sympathy, describing her as a woman caught in her husband's schemes, too frightened to resist. Clara countered with documents showing Evelyn's signature authorizing mailbox diversions and property deeds hidden under her name. The courtroom listened in silence as each paper was entered into evidence. When Evelyn finally spoke, her voice was a whisper. "I never meant for it to hurt her. I trusted him." Her words hung in the air, part confession, part plea. Clara remained composed. "Mrs. Burke, did you provide your husband with your daughter's old documents for the purpose of copying her signature?" Evelyn's silence stretched until the judge pressed her. Finally, she nodded, once the motion small but unmistakable. The judge's gavel tapped lightly. "We will proceed with conspiracy charges," she announced. Mercer's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't object. Evelyn sat frozen, her hands folded tight in her lap. Outside the courthouse, the autumn air was sharp, carrying the scent of wet leaves. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid me now offered quiet words of encouragement. Mrs. Garcia from down the block pressed a warm pie into Mason's hands. "We've always known something wasn't right with him," she murmured, her eyes kind. "You did the right thing, dear." That evening, Clara joined us at Mason's bungalow with takeout containers stacked high on the counter. We ate around the table that had become a war room, papers and binders pushed aside for plates and glasses. Mason raised his drink. To facing down bullies, he set his voice steady. Clara's eyes softened. "To building a case no one can tear apart." Later, my phone rang. It was Jackson. "We have confirmation," he said. "Brandon Weiss has signed a full statement. He admitted to knowingly overriding the system at Raymond's instruction. That gives us federal grounds now." I sank into the porch swing, listening to the creak of the chains as the night settled around me. Mason stepped outside, sitting quietly beside me. We didn't need words. The turning point had come, and it was ours. The next morning, Evelyn called me for the first time in weeks. Her voice trembled as she begged me to drop the charges, insisting Raymond had only meant it as a temporary solution. I listened in silence, my hand steady on the phone. When she fell quiet, I spoke evenly. "It's not in my hands anymore, Mom. The truth is out." She began to cry softly before the line went dead. By the end of that week, federal investigators had joined the case. Clara and Jackson worked side by side, their strategy now aimed at both state and federal prosecution. The binders Mason and I had assembled were turned into exhibits, each page a brick in the wall closing around Evelyn and Raymond. As I sat in the quiet of Mason's kitchen, watching the morning light stretch across the floor, I realized the balance had shifted completely. For months I had felt hunted, pushed into silence by guilt and intimidation. Now, for the first time, they were the ones cornered, their voices stripped of power. The next hearing would decide the scope of restitution and the final set of charges. Clara's words echoed in my mind. "This is where we make it permanent." I gathered the folders, my hands steady, and looked toward Mason. "We're ready," I said. The final day in court arrived under a steady drizzle rain streaking down the courthouse steps, as if the stone itself needed cleansing. Inside, the gallery filled early neighbors and church members, sliding into polished benches, their whispers carrying the weight of curiosity and judgment. Mason stayed close at my side, his hand resting briefly against my arm before we took our seats near the front. Clara spread out the last binder, her tabs carefully arranged, while Jackson stood with his notes already in order. Evelyn entered first, her cream sweater pulled tight around her shoulders, her eyes avoiding mine. Raymond followed in shackles, flanked by deputies, the chain at his wrists clinking softly as he took his place at the defense table. His once confident stride had been replaced by a stiffness that revealed the toll of weeks in custody. Mercer adjusted his tie, trying to maintain the illusion of control, as Judge Lane entered and called the session to order. The prosecutor began with a clear, steady voice outlining the charges one by one: identity theft, bank fraud, conspiracy. He moved seamlessly through the timeline evidence displayed on the screen behind him: bank statements, forged signatures, the spreadsheet from Raymond's laptop. Witnesses repeated their earlier testimony, this time with even more conviction. Arthur pointed again to the signatures that didn't match. Brandon described the instructions he had received, and the deputy presented photographs of the vandalized cabin. Each piece fell into place like bricks in a wall. Mercer rose to counter, his tone smooth, but stretched thin. He argued that the family had acted out of desperation, that Evelyn had been manipulated by her husband, that Raymond's actions were reckless but not malicious. When Evelyn took the stand, she wept openly, telling the judge that she had only wanted to protect me from financial mistakes, that she had been swept along by her husband's promises. Her voice trembled as she spoke, her gaze darting toward the gallery where her friends from church sat watching. Clara rose slowly for cross-examination. "Mrs. Burke," she said evenly, "you told this court you never intended to harm your daughter. Yet your handwriting appears on the documents authorizing a private mailbox used to divert her mail. Did you sign this authorization?" Evelyn's tears slowed as she stared at the page. Finally, she nodded. Clara pressed on each question, deliberate. "You also provided your husband with your daughter's graduation documents for the purpose of copying her signature. Is that correct?" Evelyn's lips parted, but no words came. The silence stretched until Judge Lane prompted her. "Yes," she whispered, the sound barely audible. The prosecutor moved next to Raymond. His attempt at defiance faltered under the weight of the spreadsheet projected on the screen. "Mr. Burke," Clara asked, "did you create this file tracking your stepdaughter's accounts, bonuses, and work travel?" Raymond shifted in his seat. "I was keeping things organized." Clara didn't flinch. "Organized for what purpose?" "To intercept her mail when she was traveling, to apply for loans in her name." Raymond's jaw clenched. After a long pause, he muttered, "Yes." The admission rippled through the courtroom, the gallery murmuring before the gavel struck sharply. Judge Lane leaned forward, her expression stern. "This court recognizes the calculated nature of these acts," she said. "This was not a momentary lapse. It was a sustained pattern of fraud and intimidation." Her words hung heavy in the air, drawing a line that could not be softened. When it was my turn to speak, I rose slowly, my legs steady beneath me. The courtroom felt impossibly still as I stepped to the podium. My voice carried clearly, each word measured. What they stole wasn't just money. It was trust. The belief that my family would keep me safe, not use me. I stand here not asking for vengeance, but for justice, for consequences that match the choices they made, not just for me, but for anyone who has been silenced by guilt and fear. Judge Lane nodded, once her gaze steady. She turned to Raymond first. "For identity theft, bank fraud, and conspiracy, this court sentences you to 14 years in federal custody." The clink of handcuffs echoed as the deputies moved closer. Raymond's face tightened, his shoulders sagging as the reality settled over him. Evelyn's sobs filled the room, her tissue crumpled in her hands. The judge turned next to my mother. "Mrs. Burke, your role in this conspiracy cannot be ignored. While your cooperation may lessen the penalty, you will serve 2 years probation and be subject to financial restitution orders." Evelyn's shoulders collapsed as the words landed, her friends in the gallery shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The gavel struck again, closing the session. The deputies led Raymond out, his figure diminished by chains and silence. Evelyn remained seated, staring at the table before her, unable to meet my eyes. The courtroom slowly emptied, the whispers fading into the hallway, until only a few of us remained. Clara placed a steady hand on my arm. "You did everything right," she said softly. Jackson gathered his files, adding, "This case will serve as a model for others. What you endured will help more families find their way out." Mason stood quietly beside me, his presence a solid anchor in the shifting air. Outside, the rain had eased the steps, slick but clean under the fading light. I paused halfway down, lifting my face toward the damp sky. The air felt lighter, washed clear of the weight that had clung for so long. Mason opened his umbrella and held it above us, his voice low. "It's over." I nodded, the words sinking in as the courthouse loomed behind us. For the first time, I walked away without fear pressing at my back. The rain had already dried on the courthouse steps by the time I returned home, but the air still held that clean, sharp scent of a storm passing. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe without waiting for the next blow to come. Mason grilled steaks that evening on his back porch, and Clara joined us with a bottle of wine she said she'd been saving. We didn't talk much about the sentencing or the gavel striking down. Instead, we sat together under the fading light, letting the quiet settle around us. In the weeks that followed, my life slowly began to piece itself back together. The credit bureaus lifted the fraud flags one by one, and letters arrived confirming that accounts in my name were officially closed. Jackson called to let me know restitution had been secured, though he cautioned that money was only part of what had been taken. Mason and I repaired the family cabin that had been vandalized, replacing broken windows and sanding fresh boards into place. Standing on that porch with a hammer in my hand, I realized the space no longer felt like a reminder of betrayal. It felt like a chance to build something new. Evelyn wrote me a letter not long after the sentencing. The words were careful, wrapped in guilt and apology, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. Clara told me I didn't owe her reconciliation, only honesty with myself. For the first time, I didn't feel crushed by the weight of guilt when I chose silence. Some ties, I understood now, can only be carried so far before they break for good. Work offered me the promotion I had once thought was slipping away when debt collectors began calling. The title felt almost secondary to the sense of stability it carried. I no longer worried about opening mail or answering the phone. I started using my evenings differently too, meeting with neighbors at the senior center to talk about how to spot financial fraud, showing them what papers to keep and what red flags to look for. When I saw their relief at knowing they weren't alone, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: purpose. One afternoon at Maple Ridge Community Credit Union, I noticed an older woman twisting a tissue in her hands while her son hovered over her shoulder with a loan application. The moment felt achingly familiar. I introduced myself gently, offering to review her account before she signed anything. She looked at me for a long moment, then quietly nodded. Watching her shoulders ease as she realized she had options, I knew I was standing exactly where I was meant to be. A year after the confrontation that changed everything, Mason and I opened the cabin doors to our first small retreat for families recovering from financial abuse. The room smelled of cedar and fresh paint sunlight streaming through glass that hadn't been there the year before. We didn't need to say much to one another. The steady hum of voices in the next room told us we'd turned pain into something that might help others find their own way through. Looking back, I realized justice wasn't just the sentence handed down in a courtroom. It was in every choice to stand tall when silence would have been easier, in every moment I chose dignity over fear, in every bond rebuilt with honesty instead of obligation. Family, I learned, isn't defined by blood or by shared last names. It's built by the people who stand beside you when storms rise, who steady your hand when you're too shaken to hold a pen, and who remind you of your worth when others try to take it away. As I sit on the cabin porch now, coffee warm in my hands, I can hear Mason working inside, the sound of wood being shaped into something lasting. The lake reflects the evening light rippling gently in the breeze. This place, once scarred by betrayal, has become a space of healing, and so have I. If you've ever carried the weight of someone else's choices, I hope my story reminds you that justice can be found even if it takes time. Strength grows quietly, piece by piece, until one day you realize it's yours to keep. Before I end, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more journeys like mine. Your voice matters, and your strength might just help someone else find their own.